What I'd like to talk to you about for, let's say, 20, 25 minutes, and then have your questions, is the book that was just mentioned, The Powers to Lead. And I wrote this book because I didn't think there was a book that was both short and readable and analytical about leadership. And that the way we as a people were thinking about leadership was mistaken. What we were sort of stuck with an old-fashioned view of leadership and power. And we tended to think of leadership as you might think of a hierarchy. You know, leader is the king of the mountain, which fit pretty well for the industrial age. But we're now in an information age, and while there still is hierarchy, networks are a lot more important. And they need to think of leadership more like being in the middle of a circle, rather than just being the king of the mountain. And so I wrote the book to try to explain what goes into the powers to lead. Now, power is pretty easy to understand. It's the ability to affect others to get what you want. And there are three ways you can do it. You can do it by threatening people with coercion, sticks. You can do it by paying people, carrots, or you can do it by attracting people and getting them to want what you want. That latter is soft power. And if you can attract people to want what you want, you can save a lot of carrots and sticks. Now, the way we think about leadership has tended very much to focus on hard power, the coercion or payment, and not enough on soft power. So that our images of leaders are the great warrior, you know, handed down from history, the great general, the Achilles, and so forth. And that image is not totally obsolete, but it can be misleading. And we have to think more in terms of leadership as consisting of a triangle of three different things. One is the leader. What are the traits of the person? Second are the followers. Without followers, there's no leader. And what are their needs? And third, and most important, and this is what I'm going to stress tonight, is the context in which the leaders and the followers interact. And just to give you an example to fix that in your mind, if you think about Winston Churchill, he was often considered one of the great leaders of the 20th century, and you ask yourself, if it were January of 1940, would I guess that Winston Churchill was going to be seen as one of the great leaders of the 20th century? The answer was no. In January of 1940, Churchill was widely regarded as a washed-up backbench member of Parliament. The conservative Prime Minister, Stanley Baldwin, had commented about Churchill with the phrase, "Oh yes, there's Winston, but nobody listens to it." Within 6 months, by June of 1940, Churchill was the charismatic leader of Britain. He was the person that everybody turned to, all the followers returning to him. So what happened in those 6 months? Did Churchill change? No, not one iota. What changed was the context. Hitler broke through the Ardennes, drove British forces into the sea, and in that context, what the British people wanted, what the followers wanted, was somebody who had sounded like a cowboy or too reckless 6 months earlier, somebody who would rally them to fight on the beaches and in the streets and so forth. So you have to understand context if you're going to understand leadership. Now, going back, though, to the traits of the individual, there still is in our minds something that prevents us from understanding leadership, which is what I call the big man theory of leadership. And the big man theory of leadership is that, you know, just what it says. You know, the leader's got to look like a big man. And there is some truth in it, the following sense. If you do a study of chief executive officers of American corporations, they are on average taller. Or if you do another study, and these studies have been done, it's true that an extra inch of height is worth another $800 of salary for an American male. So you say, well, doesn't that prove the big man theory? Well, not necessarily. It may, in fact, be spurious causation. We may, in fact, put people in these jobs or pay them more because we think they look like leaders, not because they're leaders who deserve to be there. And if you think back historically, some of the most powerful figures in history have been little over 5 feet tall. Think of Napoleon, think of Stalin, think of Deng Xiaoping. These were extraordinarily powerful people who were really not big men. Now, there are some who try to rescue this big man theory by saying, yes, but you know, it's in our genes. If you think about humans, we are 99%, nearly 99%, the same as chimpanzees. The human genome and the chimpanzee genome are almost overlapping. There's only a little over 1% difference. And when you look at how chimpanzees behave, there's always an alpha male. You know, one who's more robust, bigger, takes the lead. And so the people who like the big man theory of leadership say, not much we can do about it. It's genetic. Just, you know, sit back and accept it. The trouble with that is that when psychologists have tried to identify genes that could show who is going to be a leader or not, they've done some interesting tests. They've taken fraternal twins and identical twins. Fraternal twins share 50% of their genetic material. Identical twins are 100% genetically the same. And what they find is you can explain about 1/3 of leadership positions by genetics, but there's 2/3 you can't explain. So the score based on these tests is nurture 2, nature 1. And there's another telling counter to this chimpanzee or sociobiological approach to explaining leadership, which is that it turns out that there's another form of chimpanzee which is as closely related to us as the large chimpanzees. It's a slightly smaller chimpanzee called bonobos that live in the eastern Congo. And the interesting about bonobos is that they're ruled by females, not males. Now, half of you are going like this and half of you are going like that, but it happens to be true. That's led some people to say, well, you know, if we're moving from a world of hierarchy of the industrial age to a world of networks or circles, maybe women's time as leaders has finally come. And there are studies that have shown that women generally intuit soft power better. They have a better sense of how to deal with networks, how to use attraction, and so forth. And so there's some people who say maybe what we need to do is replace the big man theory of leadership with the big woman theory of leadership, that we're finally entering the age of women's leadership. The trouble with that is if you phrase it that way, you're still stuck with gender stereotypes. And once you use gender stereotypes to explain things, you're going to get in the way. I mean, you're going to stop your thinking. So what I try to do in this book is say, what are the things that men need to do to act more like women in some contexts, and women need to do to act more like men in some contexts? In other words, get away from gender and instead say, what are the crucial skills, soft power and hard power skills, that a leader needs to be effective in different contexts? And I identify 3 critical soft power skills that a leader needs, whether male or female, and 2 critical hard power skills, and then the skill of contextual intelligence of knowing how to combine them into smart power. Of the Soft power skills, perhaps the most important, is what psychologists call emotional intelligence. Now, you all know what IQ is. IQ is the ability to do very well in the French school system about 1890. You know, math, spatial relations, and so forth. And when psychologists have tried to account for success in life, and they've asked how well is it correlated with traditional IQ measures, the answer is IQ, traditional IQ, can explain about 20% of success. So there's 80% that's unexplained. Part of that 80%, not all of it, but part of it is what psychologists call emotional intelligence. The ability to master your emotions and use them to reach out and attract others. And that is an extraordinarily important skill. To give you an example from using of American presidents as an example, Franklin Roosevelt had great emotional intelligence. When Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes was introduced to Roosevelt, he was asked after he met the new president, "What'd you think?" And he said, "Second-class intellect, but first-class temperament." In other words, good emotional intelligence. Think of Richard Nixon, who probably could have outscored Roosevelt by far on a traditional IQ test, but whose idea of emotional intelligence was to develop an enemies list. And you can see that the success of one president and the relative lesser successful presidency of the other probably owed more to emotional intelligence than to traditional IQ. A second skill that's crucial to attract people, a soft power skill, is vision, an ability to portray a picture of the future that gives meaning to others and makes them want to follow you. And a good vision is extraordinarily important. But notice that a good vision has to be more than a wish list. You can't just give people happy thoughts or impossible dreams. That's the way you can drive them over a cliff. And so a good vision has to combine things that will move and inspire people with a sense of reality of how to get there. And here it's interesting comparing the two Bush presidencies, who are incidentally as genetically close as we're going to see in modern times, and yet very different. Bush 41 said essentially, "I don't do the vision thing," and he was punished for that by the electorate. Bush 43, reacting against his father, placed enormous emphasis on the vision and had, if you listen to the rhetoric of, for example, his second inaugural address, a very attractive vision, sounded very much like Woodrow Wilson, but not related to the reality of the cultures in which he was sending American troops. And so that key question of which is more important, the lack of a vision or the wrong vision, obviously something in between makes more sense. I would say that Ronald Reagan was a president who was quite successful in terms of a practical vision. The third of the key soft power skills is communications. And communications is the ability to take your vision and to transfer it to others so that they want to follow you. Now, in terms of communications, we often think of rhetoric, the ability to give a good speech. And the classic example of that, I just heard a snippet of it again this afternoon in touring the library, is Martin Luther King. And King's ability to take the vocabulary and the cadences of the African American church and to use them to reach out to a far broader audience is a brilliant example of oral or verbal communication. But it's also worth noticing that nonverbal communication is equally important. Psychologists, again, tell us that about half of our communication as humans is nonverbal. And if you look at a leader, to take another great leader of the 20th century, Mahatma Gandhi, the first time I saw a video or a film clip of Gandhi, I thought, my goodness, this man who's a great leader is not a great speaker. And you think, how is this possible? Then you realize that Gandhi was brilliant in nonverbal communication. If you look at Gandhi coming back from London, where he trained in the Inns of Court to be a lawyer with his three-piece suit all buttoned up and so forth, then look at a picture of Gandhi later as the leader of a nationalist movement dressed in a peasant's loincloth. You realize how good Gandhi was at using nonverbal communication. Or look at the way Gandhi organized his salt march to the sea to make salt, which was against the British law from the sea. And it took him forever to get weeks for this march to reach the sea. Why? Because it was a form of nonverbal communication. So communication is the third key soft power skill: emotional IQ, vision, and communication. Now, you also need to be an effective leader to have hard power skills. And there are two that I think are particularly important. One is organization. And organization doesn't mean just filling in the boxes of a large corporation or bureaucracy. It means organizing so that the flows of information that come to you and that go out from you give you a picture of the whole. And that might sound obvious, except that when you're in power as a leader, one of the biggest problems you face is the emperor's clothes problem. Remember the Hans Christian Andersen fairy tale, that it takes a little boy who is not beholden to the emperor in power terms to say, "Your Majesty, you're naked." And that's all too often the case with presidents or other powerful leaders, that it's hard to get people to speak truth to power. And therefore, it's extraordinarily important for a leader to make sure that he or she organizes the flows of information coming in and going out so that you can overcome this problem of power interfering with free flow of information. And again, you can contrast the two Bush presidencies on this. If Bush 41 was weak on vision, he was extraordinarily good on organization. If you look at his foreign policy, for example, he had Brent Scowcroft organized so that he heard different views, that every view was represented. Bush 43, even though he had a Harvard MBA, was actually not very good at organization. He let Rumsfeld and Cheney run a second track that cut Powell out of the action, and the governmental process was broken as a result. Now, I think the important point here is not the particulars of the Bushes, but to illustrate the need for a leader to be good at organization, particularly in relation to power. And the second hard power skill that a leader needs is what I call Machiavellian political skills. And that's the ability to size up the likes and dislikes, the wants and needs in a group of people, and to figure how to play upon those to develop a minimum winning coalition so that you can get things done. And Lyndon Johnson was very good at this. Now some people say, yes, but Johnson was a bully, and isn't bullying counterproductive? Bullying without vision is indeed counterproductive. But it's worth noticing that if you can use these Machiavellian skills with a sense of purpose or vision, it may be productive. Let me give you the example of Admiral Rickover, who's the father of the American nuclear navy. You think Admiral Rickover, this tall, swashbuckling sea captain on the prow of the ship and so forth. No, Rickover was a little man near the bottom of his class at Annapolis who had extraordinary skill at building coalitions with Congress to get resources, and who, even though he was a bit of a bully to the people that worked for him, had a commitment to a vision of taking an extraordinarily complex technology, nuclear energy, putting it inside the hull of a boat underwater and never having an accident. That vision meant young, bright naval officers wanted to work for him. He may not have been pleasant to work for, but they knew they were on a mission they cared about, and he was going to get it done. So those are the hard power skills, organization and Machiavellian political skills. But what about the mix? And that's where contextual intelligence comes in, or the sixth key skill. You need to be able to adjust that mix for different contexts. All too often you'll hear about the chief executive officer who goes to Washington. He's been a great CEO, but he's a failure as a cabinet secretary. Or you'll hear about the person who is a terrific politician or very good at, let's say, running an organization, then goes to be head of a university, and she turns out not to be very good at that. And the difference, of course, is that power is totally differently distributed. In a hierarchy, you have more hard power resources. In a university, you have very few hard power resources. You have all these tenured professors. What can you do? You can't fire them. You can't cut their salaries. Maybe you can take away their parking places. But you really, if you can't attract them with your vision, you're not going to get anything done. So contextual intelligence is the ability to adjust your mix of skills for the different contexts. And that ability to develop a strategy in which you've adjusted your hard and soft power skills is what I call smart power. Now, can you learn smart power? I mean, it's nice to identify these things. Is there anything you do about it? And the answer to that is yes. Not everybody's going to be a great piano player. I know, because I was lousy at piano lessons. But with enough lessons, even people who are not normally talented can perhaps play the piano decently. Not everybody is a natural, in quotes, leader, but they can train themselves to the point where they can be above average. And that's what the American Army does. The Army finds that it has a great mix of people, some with more proclivities in the right direction, others with less. But they say we can train people to improve their leadership capacity. And they have a little phrase that they use to summarize this that they call B, B-E, know, K-N-O-W, do, D-O. B means understand yourself. Understand your limits, your weaknesses. Or another way of putting it is develop your emotional intelligence. Know what you're good or not as good at, how to master your inner demons or to harness your capacities to reach out to others. Know, K-N-O-W, means learn from history. Learn from the lessons of those who've gone before. What things have worked or not worked? What are the things where others have failed in one context and succeeded in another? And do means practice. Go out and apply this. But it's not enough just to apply it. You have to do what the Army calls an after-action review. Every time you do something in leadership, come back and ask yourself, what went wrong? What went right? How could I have done better? And that combination of be, know, do is the way you can indeed develop your contextual intelligence. Now let me take this in concluding and apply it to the United States and where we fit in the world today. We've not always been very good at understanding the context of American power in the world. If you go back to 1990, if you take 20 years ago, you would find that the conventional wisdom about the American power was what? Do you remember that? Decline. We were finished, over the hill. My friend, the British historian Paul Kennedy, wrote a book called The Rise and Fall of the Great Powers. It said that the United States was going the way of Philip II's Spain or Edwardian England. It was over. And that was quite widely believed. Indeed, in 1992, Paul Tsongas ran for president with the slogan, "The Cold War is over and Japan has won." I wrote a book about that time called Bound to Lead that said the United States was going to be the leading country of the 21st century. And I think I may have got the answer right, but Kennedy got all the royalties. The conventional wisdom was we were finished. We were in decline. Now fast forward 10 years to 2001. What was the conventional wisdom? We were number one. We were on top. It was a unipolar world. The columnist Charles Krauthammer wrote a column in early 2001 about the new unilateralism. Said it's a unipolar world. The Americans are so strong that we can do whatever we want and others have no choice but to follow. Well, that got us into some pretty big trouble. And now we're trying to figure out where we are between these two. Essentially, we as Americans let this pendulum of overestimation and underestimation swing back and forth. And perhaps the best way to understand the world today is to think of the context of American power as analogous to a three-dimensional chess game. On the first board of the three-dimensional game, the top board, which is military relations between states, the United States is number one. The world is unipolar. And that's going to stay that way for a couple of decades or more. People say, oh, well, you know, others will team up to balance us. Well, wait a minute. The Americans spend half of all world military expenditures. Nobody's going to balance us. This is new. It's unique. And we should realize that there is that dimension. But if you go to the middle board of the three chess boards, the board of economic relations among states, you'll find that the world is multipolar and has been for a decade or more. Other countries can balance American power. For example, when Jack Welch, the former CEO of General Electric, wanted to merge GE and Honeywell, both American companies, he got the Justice Department in Washington to approve it. It was approved. But he went to Brussels and asked the European Union Commission to approve it, and they said no, anti-competitive. The deal didn't go through. If that isn't balancing American power, I don't know what is. Now go to the bottom board of this three-dimensional game, the board of transnational relations, things that cross borders outside the control of governments. Things like climate change, pandemics, transnational terrorism, drug trade, and so forth. And you'll find that power is chaotically organized. It makes no sense to talk about unipolarity or multipolarity. Essentially, it's chaotic. And the only way you can deal with these issues, these new challenges, is to get cooperation among governments. And the interesting thing about that is that that's where many of the largest challenges we as a people face today. I've called this the paradox of American power, that the world's strongest country can't protect its own citizens acting alone. And yet, much of what we've seen over the past decade has been a tendency of Americans to focus on that top board only. And the danger of that is that if you're playing three-dimensional chess and you play on one board only, in the long run, you're going to lose. So we as a people have to understand this much more complex context of where America fits in the world. In some ways, we remain number one. In other ways, there is no number one. And the key is to figure out how do we use a combination of our hard and soft power skills into a smart power strategy to attract and organize others to get things done. And that's why I think what Skip Rutherford said and what Barry said about the president's trip and the new efforts are so very important. Can we develop a smart power strategy? Can our leaders develop the contextual intelligence to understand the type of situation we face today? That, I think, is going to be the great question, and that is partly why I wrote this book, The Powers to Lead, to try to get people to think of leadership in this new way, rather than some of the simplistic big man theories that we've used in the past. So let me stop there and turn it over to you for questions, which to me is always the more interesting part of the evening.
Well, before we enter the questions, I think we should give our speaker a round of applause. We do have 2 volunteers, each with a mic, and so if you'd raise your hand, then I'll recognize you. That way everyone can hear and everyone can participate. We'll start with, Greg.
Thank you. Dr. Nye, I'm interested in your reaction to something I've studied and looked at, being a native from Detroit, Michigan, in the automotive business and what's happening, and so sad to my hometown. But the contrast in leadership between Lee Iacocca, who during the day took $1 a salary as he rebuilt an ailing Chrysler, to today's mentality of taking the buyouts and running. Interested in your interpretation of that.
Well, I think that if you look at what's happened to the American automobile industry, there have been obvious problems of leadership. Now, there's an argument that Rick Wagner was a sacrificial lamb and didn't deserve all the slaughtering to be he wasn't the only one. But I think it is true that the leaders of the top corporations in Detroit had not thought about the adjustments that were necessary. They let the Japanese essentially take the new wave of market, the fuel-efficient and hybrid cars, and were too slow. I mean, back in the early 90s, GM did develop an electric car, but then they killed it. It wasn't profitable. In the meantime, the Japanese were Toyota was taking losses early on because they knew they'd march down a learning curve and would eventually get the Prius to a step where they could sell it. So I think it was a failure of leadership on the part of the American auto companies. And I think it's interesting that Iacocca, 20 years earlier, had not only developed a strategy for Chrysler and saving Chrysler, and you might say yes, but he didn't face the kind of recession that the current generation faces, but he also had a sense of contextual intelligence. I mean, that $1 a year was very important, and the idea that the CEOs flew in on private planes rather than the $1 a year was that there was a tone deafness to context which indicated a failure of leadership. They're not alone. I would say the investment banking community did even better in terms of tone deafness. But, yeah.
Bob, we'll go with.
It was a great talk. I really enjoyed all of it. The one question I had was, leadership often rests on a bedrock of moral values. And leaders often rise to the top because they have the ability to withstand the pressures. So where does that figure into your scheme?
Well, moral values are extremely important for leaders. And in fact, there's a whole chapter, 1 out of the 5 chapters in the book is exactly on that. But it turns out to be a little bit more complex than it first looks. Sometimes the moral values which are attractive and effective for leaders attract some, but repel others. Or another way of putting it is there may be different moral codes which are effective in different ways. It's hard to accept, but Osama bin Laden has a lot of soft power for those who followed him. Bin Laden didn't pay or threaten the people who flew those planes in the World Trade Center. He attracted them. He attracted them with what we regard as a crazy set of moral values, or bad set of moral values, but nonetheless it's true. And I think the important point is for us to be training leaders and educating leaders on the importance of using good values to be effective. And most interesting in today's world, given the complexity of the information age and globalization, it's how can a leader help to educate his or her followers toward a broader moral outlook? And a great example of this is Nelson Mandela. I mean, Mandela had every right in the world to be bitter and to lead a vendetta against the white South Africans. Instead, he decided that his job was to convince his followers, who had every right for grievance, that conciliation was the right thing. And when Nelson Mandela in 1995 put on the game jersey of the Springboks Rugby Club, which was an all-white team, but a national symbol, it was a very powerful educational, nonverbal educational communication. So leaders can make a huge difference. And what we want is leaders who exercise the right kind of moral values and are able to find the skills to communicate them.
I too enjoyed the talk. My name is Todd Scholl, and my question is, with soft power today, there was an entree by Fidel Castro recently that he would be willing to sit down and talk to our president. You know, we've kind of been on that two chessboards actually there with Cuba for some time, and I think that there's a lot of people that think that opening the dialogue and the commerce would be great. What's your thought on how, you know, your theory applies there with President Obama?
Well, I think I have no time for Castro. I think he's a dictator. But I do think that our policy toward him has been counterproductive. If you ask what's the hardest job for a dictator in the information age, it's to cut his people off. If he wants to control them, cutting them off from outside influences is one of the hardest things he faces. Who's done that for him? Uncle Sam. You know, if we had allowed more trade, more contacts, more flows of people and ideas, I don't think Castro would be there today. Now, there are very strong reasons in domestic politics why that's hard to do. But I think it is interesting that President Obama suggested the beginnings of a movement to ease up on that by letting families be reunited, which will help to bring more ideas into Cuba.
Next question. Let's Tezra, one of the Clinton School students.
You talked about soft power, hard power, and smart power. Can women use this strategy to access political power and decision making, especially when men still control politics and dominate it? Thank you.
Well, I think that, yes, you can. The ability to combine hard and soft power skills is essential for a good strategy for gaining political power. And I think, ironically, it's still a little bit harder for women in politics than for men because of, let's say, our visions from the past. A woman has to often prove she's tough, that she has hard power, and that makes it harder for her to exercise soft power. In other words, if she exercises soft power, she's playing to type, and people wonder if she's tough enough. And whereas if she proves she's tough enough, she may give up the soft power dimensions of the skill. So you look at women who've succeeded, like Margaret Thatcher or Golda Meir or Indira Gandhi, they've been on the tough side. It's only now that I think as you're getting a larger proportion of women in politics that you're beginning to see some better balance or a climate or a context in women have a better chance to show how they combine their hard and soft power skills. The president of Chile, Michelle Bachelet, seems to be a good example of that. And the Scandinavian countries have had a number of quite successful prime ministers. Gro Harlem Brundtland is one. So it can be done, but I do think that we're still outgrowing or overcoming the big man theory, which means that it's harder for women.
Next question.
Reflecting back on the 2008 primary elections, what do you see in McCain and Obama? Why did they specifically emerge as leaders over their respective parties?
Well, I think, I mean, that's an interesting question, why McCain and Obama. I think that Obama proved very good at using, I mean, Obama has hard power skills. You don't grow up in Chicago politics and not understand hard power. And that ability to organize, he's proved, I mean, his campaign was superbly organized. But he was very good at those soft power skills I mentioned. Emotional intelligence, no drama Obama, very important. The vision of how we're going to change the country, not a red America or a blue America, a United States of America. And also communication skills, extraordinarily good at communication skills. So I think that those served him very well in terms of his winning the Democratic primary. Now, Hillary Clinton was also very good and came very close. But I do think the answer to my prior question had some effect there. It's very much harder for Hillary Clinton in the primaries to show her soft side. So she allowed that vision on the soft side to be captured by her opponent. On the Republican side, I think John McCain had an advantage of being seen as the maverick, the person who wasn't the person who was willing to stand up to the party, to be more independent, more in the middle. And I think this served him very well. And I think that the problems that his contenders faced, whether it be Giuliani, who was too late getting into the game, didn't organize very well, or whether it be Mitt Romney, who essentially couldn't get his own message. He was a relatively liberal governor of Massachusetts, who then repudiated his own position, running for the right of the party. And I think that, that McCain sort of was able to be quite effective that way. I think the question of could he have won, these counterfactuals are always difficult, but I think once you had the combination of the unpopularity of the incumbent Republican president plus an economic crisis, I think it was probably unwinnable for him. If it had been, let's say, a different era, the year 2000, when McCain ran the first time, it might have come out differently.
We have right there.
Professor Nye, I was wondering if you could maybe put on your professor cap and evaluate Obama at this point. I know it's really early, but a couple months ago, he increased funding for USAID, and as we know last week, put F-22 and major programs on the chopping block. Are we starting to see a presidency that basically embraces this smart power concept? And can you maybe evaluate some more of that? And I guess my real question is America really ready for that?
Well, it's, we're 70 days or 77 days into it, so any judgment is going to be premature. But with that said, let me take some guesses. What strikes me is that if you look at how he started with his appointments, I think keeping Bob Gates in defense was very smart. It means he had somebody experienced in running the Pentagon, so that when he had to figure out what he was going to say on Iraq and Afghanistan, he essentially had continuity there. And similarly, when he decided to stop the F-22 production line with only 4 more, it was done by a person who wasn't a left-wing Democrat, in quotes, anti-defense. It was done by a Republican who'd been George Bush's Secretary of Defense, who said, wait a minute, folks, we've got to move resources from fighter planes which can drive Soviet fighters out of the sky, and instead put those resources into on-the-ground things that help our troops who are fighting on the ground now. So I think there was a credibility that he gained by the way he made his appointments, or Jim Jones, the former commandant of the Marine Corps, and head of NATO as the national security advisor. So this protected him on the hard power side. In other words, he wasn't just playing to left-wing Democratic types. On the other hand, appointing Hillary Clinton as Secretary of State, I think, was very smart. A lot of people said, you know, she's so powerful, she'll run her own policy, she'll get cross eyes with him. Hillary Clinton is one smart person, and she knows that if there's ever a battle between a president and a Secretary of State, the Secretary of State loses, not the president. And so I think what he's done is by taking somebody with an enormous amount of star power and soft power of her own, attractiveness, he's been able to magnify his own. So he had Hillary going to Japan, Indonesia, and China as a first trip to signal the importance of Asia and to attract people, and then he was later able to do the same thing in Europe. These are extraordinarily interesting balances, which I would say is an indication of a smart power strategy. That that he has very good contextual intelligence and knows how to combine these different skills. Now, I say that with the proviso that we're still only, you know, early in the game. It's, as a Red Sox fan, we're at the first inning, not even at the bottom of the first inning.
Okay, we're going to have time for 2 more questions. Dr. Peggy Scranton's in the back.
Would you say a word about U.S. relations with North Korea and what a smart power strategy might look like for getting them to follow a U.S. lead?
Well, the North Korean situation is particularly difficult because this is a state which is really a leftover from the 1950s or from the Cold War. I mean, it's a rigid, ideologically controlled dictatorship, and they are extremely difficult to deal with. You have to pay attention to them, but you're not going to be able to attract them. In other words, soft power is not going to get Kim Jong-il to give up his nuclear weapons program. On the other hand, you do need to try to attract other states to work together in terms of surrounding him. And you've got to be careful not to overreact. In other words, it's sometimes the metaphor that's used with North Korea is that like a petulant child, by stamping their feet, they get more attention. I think the missile launch we saw was a good example of that. So I think it's right to take them to the Security Council and try to get enforcement of the sanctions that were imposed in 2006 after their partially successful nuclear explosion. I'm not sure you're going to get that because the Chinese and the Russians may not go along, but we have to follow through on that. On the other hand, we don't want to say we'll never talk to you in the six-party talks or we're going to blow everything up. We sort of say, you know, we'll go on a normal course with you and try to contain the North Korean situation until eventually the regime may change. But it's not going to be easy. On the other hand, the good news is that the person that Obama has appointed to be the special envoy for North Korea, Steve Bosworth, used to be he's a professional or a career foreign service officer who used to be our ambassador to South Korea, so he knows Korea very well. And I think he'll have that sense of the right balance.
Last question, yeah, right there.
When President Clinton was in power, one of the things that he was a big supporter of was the Third Way movement. And I'm curious, you know, and he went around, of course, internationally and promoted it to a great deal. And I was curious in what ways your theory and your thesis really might correlate with that movement.
Well, I thought the Third Way was interesting. In fact, I once went with a delegation that Hillary Clinton took to Chequers, the British Prime Minister's residence, where she met with Tony Blair. The president couldn't come because of a budget crisis, and Then I went to another meeting that they held in the White House when the British came back. The problem is it was difficult to sell it to others. I mean, in places like Germany and France and so forth, there was partly not invented here. And also, it didn't fit quite the same traditions. There's not the same left-right spectrum where you can look for a middle third way in those politics. So it didn't travel well. I mean, I think a lot of what they were trying to do made a lot of sense. And it worked fairly well for Blair and Clinton, but it didn't work too well for others. What I'm trying to talk about in smart power is not the equivalent of triangulation of, say, give one for hard and one for soft. There may be some circumstances where you're going to have to focus almost entirely on hard. The North Korean case, I think, is going, if it's settled at all, will be through economic sanctions, and the country that has the only country with real clout there is China. I don't expect soft power to play much there. On the other hand, if I'm trying to talk about democratization or promotion of human rights and so forth, soft power is much more effective than the barrel of a gun. And so I think that it's not just always split the difference between them. The third way is not necessarily the equidistant between these two. It's saying, how do I adjust these approaches for the different contexts? So I think goes back to the point that I tried to stress in my talk tonight, and it's a central theme of the book. There's a whole chapter on the book, which is the importance of contextual intelligence. And how do we train people for improving their contextual intelligence?